Okay, today we're going to talk about grazing, the impact of grazing, and human interaction on the diversification of grasses. So about 65 million years ago, the ungulates, which can generally be grouped up into the hoofed mammals, in particular an animal called the condylarth, which is kind of a primitive placental mammal. It showed the first signs of being both insectivorous as well as herbivorous, so it was showing the first signs of becoming an omnivore, which is basically what mammals are today. We eat just about anything. And this early animal was believed to have grazed early C3 grasslands. And so as the grazing began by hoofed animals, we see a change in how grasses develop and how these grasses then adapt to this grazing. And that plays a huge role even today in terms of how grasses have developed and adapt to changes. Then about 55 million years ago, the early ruminants, which are derivatives of the ungulates, the artiodactyls, which in modern era would be the horses, the horse group. And then 23 to 5 million years ago, the bovidae, which is the bovine or the cows and those kinds of animals, begin to develop. And they're also grazing grasslands. And so in this period from 65 to 23 or so million years ago, the grasses are kind of a minor component of the forested land. And most of the lands on Laurasia and Gondwana and so on are forested. And as these continents develop and we start to get the continents that we know today, most of that land area is forested. And grasses were a minor component of that. Mostly found on the edges. But as openings occur, diseases and other pests and things would have occurred. Those openings then lead to areas of grasses, and we get the animals that we just talked about beginning to graze those areas. And that plays a huge role in how how the grasses begin to develop. So about 5 to 6 million years ago, the climate begins to dry and warm. And that drier, warmer climate results in a major change in what we see on the continents. And that is that the tree population begins to go down. Areas begin to open up, and we start to see the first open, expansive grasslands. So in this period from like 24, 25 to 5 million years ago, we start to see this change in climate happen, and grasslands begin to develop. And in concert with that, we see the development of the bovidae, which are the bovine, the cow animals, and the ungulates, the horses, and other animals from that group, all begin to develop and expand and graze those grasslands for food. And that regular grazing, one of the main characteristics of the bovidae is that they have a tooth that regenerates. That tooth develops, and as it's grazing and it's gnawing on those grasses and it's breaking those grasses down, the tooth regenerates and recovers. And this results in regular grazing for feed. And in concert with that, it also results in what we might call lower mowing heights. So this is the first example where grasses that were normally, anywhere between 8 and 10 feet tall to 10 or 12 inches tall begin to be grazed and brought down to lower heights. And those grasses had to be able to develop and adapt to that condition. And the grasses that were able to develop and adapt to that condition are grasses that we see today. Things that we'll talk about like tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, creeping bentgrass, redtop, etc. All of these different grasses were grasses that were grazed, or ancestors of them that were grazed, and the height was lowered. And that first lowering of height resulted in the requirement of grasses to adapt and overcome and be able to recover under those more intense conditions from grazing. the Great Plains in North America begins to form somewhere between 27, 25 million years ago. And it's the first ecologically important grassland in North America. As that climate changes and we get the drop in tree populations and we get the expansive grasslands, the Great Plains is one of those expansive grasslands. Think about an area from basically the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. That area was basically open grassland with very few trees. And grasses anywhere from big blue stem, which is 12, 15 feet tall, to tiny little plants like Poa arida, which is a relative of Kentucky bluegrass. These short, stout grasses. All of these grasses were out there, and they were grazed by animals like the cows or the bovidae, as well as the ungulates like the horses and other group animals from those groups. So this grassland is the first ecologically important grassland. And the C4 grasses, the warm season grasses, the ones that do better under warmer conditions, expanded about that same time. And that coincides with this drying climate and a decrease in carbon dioxide. So all of these kinds of changes were happening at basically the same time, which again raises this question of adaptability and diversity, and the ability of these grasses to be able to adapt to these changing climates is a testament to their ability to overcome major changes in how the environment was changing and evolving over the geological history of the grasses. And these C4 grasses, it coincides with that climate change. About 6 million years ago, the cool season and the warm season distributions around the world basically seem to stabilize. That where these grasses are is about where they are today. That they've moved maybe a little bit, but we haven't seen wholesale changes. That's mostly because right about this same period of time, we have the continents about where they're at today, and the climate is roughly about what it is then. There's been warming periods and cooling periods and so on over the course of that time. But basically, the environment and the climate as we know it is fairly stable over the last 6 million years. And that stability over that period of time, relatively speaking, compared to the wholesale major changes that have occurred prior to that, that these populations and distributions have pretty well stabilized. So it's likely that as these distributions stabilized, the animals, the ungulates, the bovine, then began to graze, that the grasses and the grazing animals co-evolved, that the adaptations of the grasses were in direct result of the grazing that was occurring by these animal populations. And then we took advantage of those changes to then further domesticate these grasses into the turf grasses that we know today, the forages that we know today. And so it's this co-evolution. So we have this idea of diversity, and then we have this idea of co-evolving. Animals and plants evolving in concert together. So as the animals grazed, the plants adapted. And that those changes in both resulted in what we see today. So the result of these changes, these coevolution, we see these grasses that have basal meristems. Meristems are what we often refer to commonly as a growing point. So that's the point at which growth begins to take place, the meristem, the undifferentiated tissue in the plant. If you're not sure what that is, go back into your biology book or onto the web and look up what a meristem is. So that we see grasses with basal meristems. Meristems down at the base of the plant, down at the bottom where the roots are coming out into the soil, and they're here for a particular reason. And we're going to talk about that in class, but they're here for a particular reason. We also see shortened internodes, and that's the distance between meristems, the distance between those growing points from one point to the next on a grass plant, that internode, that distance is shortened. So that results in an increase in density. And we also see a creeping growth habit. We see the development of rhizomes and stolons. These are are specialized stem structures that either creep slightly underground or over the surface of the soil. But they're horizontal and they move and spread, and that gives the grasses the ability to move and to spread out. And this is also critically important with respect to this idea of coevolution. Interestingly, and one of the things that I think is really cool about this is that these are exactly the characteristics that we desire in a turfgrass plant today. And if we were designing a turfgrass plant that we wanted to be able to handle very close grazing, or what we might call mowing, we would want plants with basal meristems, with meristems very close to the soil surface. We would want plants with very short internodes, distances between growing points, so that density is very high. And we would want the ability of that plant to spread and move and spread out, even when it is being grazed at short heights, so that it can establish itself and survive. These are exactly the characteristics that we want in turfgrass. And that's what makes this idea of understanding grazing animals and how those changes in grazing and the development of those animals led to the grasses that we have today. And in fact, I would argue we still graze them today because we mow on a regular basis. It's one of the few plants that is mowed on a regular basis and has to be able to survive and adapt and overcome those mowings or grazings. And so it's these kinds of things that make turf grasses such a fascinating thing to look at and such an exciting thing to understand. And it's important that we understand where these ideas come from so that they might help inform where we might want to go in the future.